Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a project by the Stove Network designed to encourage pioneering approaches in charting the changes that have happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 locally, and tries to navigate the way forward into a more hopeful and shared future. In this series, Stove orchestrator Matt Baker speaks with the artists, writers and researchers involved in the project, offering an insight into the process and discoveries each have made. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Atlas Pandemica number 11. I'm Matt Baker, and along with artist Robbie Coleman, I'm one of the curators of the project. Atlas Pandemica Maps to a Kinder World is a compendium of 10 projects led by creative people, each investigating a different theme highlighted by life during the COVID pandemic. Projects work directly with people in Dumfries and Galloway, focusing on the impacts and the learning from the community's experience of the evolving pandemic. Atlas Pandemic was conceived and is managed by community-led arts organisation, the Stove Network. It explores local responses to the pandemic and how these might shape new approaches to our shared future. The project is supported by Scottish Government's Supporting Communities Fund. You can find more information at atlaspandemica.org. In this series, I've been talking to each of the artists leading one of the Atlas explorations, but today is something a bit different. One of the unique features of the Atlas Pandemica project is that we have a bibliographer attached to the project. I'll let him explain what that actually means, as I'm delighted to welcome our actual Atlas biographer, Philip Palios. Philip is a Fulbright scholar, a writer, and an educator. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Doing well, thanks. Yeah, it's great to speak with you.
Nice to see you back in Dumfries as well. It's great. So, Philip, dive in. Can you cast your mind back for us to May 2020 when Atlas Pandemica was first being talked about? How was the lockdown for you, and what drew you to get involved in the project?
Yeah, it was a pretty emotional time for me. I think, with the pandemic just setting in and lockdown, feeling the reality of lockdown after a couple of months. I was working an office job remotely and just having a lot of existential thoughts about, seeing how quickly the world can change and what am I doing with the time I have and who knows what. So I was looking at leaving that office job and really getting involved in something that would, feel like putting my best effort forward towards helping community.
And I mean, you've got a rather different relationship to our region to the others on the project. Can you tell us a little about you and Dumfries and
Yeah,
your work in general?
So I originally came to Dumfries in September 2018, and that was part of the Fulbright program. So I did a master's at the Crichton in the Environment, Culture, and Communication course, and that got me connected with Dumfries, and I immediately started getting involved with the Stove, joining High Street Writers, and getting to meet a lot of different people from the arts community around here. And that was a one-year course, and since then, it's been kind of here sometimes, not all the time, but really formed a lot of important friendships and connections with music and writing and all sorts of things. So I feel like it's my second home, and I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, well, we're very happy that you being here and the things that you've done. You've talked to me before about your kind of like journey, because you didn't start off in the creative world. You've kind of found your way into that, and I think that in terms of the context of your work as a bibliographer on this project, I think that's an interesting trajectory. So can you tell us that story? Yeah,
I worked in the IT world for about 10 years straight out of high school. I grew up around Seattle and ended up at a tech company pretty quickly, doing software development and testing type of work. And, I think I was fortunate to have that experience at such a young age. But, after a few years in, I started to really question, what was I doing with my life? Was this it? and got to hear from an economist who really changed my perspective by just presenting the idea that money for most people represents time in our life, however many dollars per hour we get paid. And that just really was a paradigm shift for me and made me think more critically about what I'm doing with my life. So that's when I set out to start writing. And, after a few years at Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, and these big tech companies, I went into education, went to finish my bachelor's degree, and then that led me here to Dumfries. And so I've been actively writing and then exploring other ways to get involved in creating literary community and looking at the ways that the arts relate to sense of place and how that's important when we look at things like the climate crisis.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, that you're thinking about community. Can you just say a bit more about how that idea you've got of community action and and culture?
So in terms of, for example, literature, I see the people who are writing and the people who are reading, and then how does that work in a specific place? With a lot of what you see when you walk into a bookshop, see the same books in bookshops in Dumfries as you might see in Seattle. And there's a big international publishing industry. And what I'm interested in is how the arts can become more local, with literature, but also with music and other forms of cultural work, and how that can make people more connected. And I think Dumfries is a great example of that. I think there's so many writers and artists and musicians around here that are well known throughout the community, and it creates a stronger care for each other and care for place when the cultural work is local, when you can put a face to it, when it's not someone you see on a screen or read about in a newspaper, but also have the chance to talk with and interact with.
Yeah, because that's ultimately so empowering for others. That sense that you can do it here, you can make that kind of career or life for yourself, and it's not some unattainable dream that's somewhere else. It's actually happening in your backyard. I mean, that connect to community is actually at the root of what Atlas Pandemica was about. So yeah, why it sort of seemed like such a nice fit, you being involved. I mean, let's get into the bibliographer thing. So could you give us your definition of what is a bibliographer, and what did you see your role in? What to start with, because we'll talk about how that evolved. But what did you think you were going to do on the project to start with?
Yeah, I think the most dry early on definition of a bibliographer would be someone looking at all these projects and cataloging the sources that they're using, the other literature or artworks or places, just anything that from the outside world that is contributing to their work, and organizing it, cataloging it, and making it available to whoever is reading about or looking at the project. I knew that wouldn't be exactly what happens with the bibliographer for Atlas Pandemica. I knew it was a more creative opportunity, but I didn't really know where that would lead. I didn't know what was expected of me, or how I could make it maybe more interesting. I think a lot of times a bibliography can be something that's just entirely passed over when you're reading an article or a book. And so I was thinking more about how can this really make a meaningful contribution.
Because I know at the time, I mean, when Robbie and I sort of conceived of the idea of something called a bibliographer, we were just, at the time, we were madly throwing each other references because so much was being written we were living through this moment in history that was being literally recorded in front of our eyes through articles, blogs, podcasts, whatever, and we felt that we needed a kind of center of gravity for that in the project of somewhere where we could literally sort of like throw it to Phil, and at least it would be kept, but hopefully also shared. And as the team grew, that we figured that would sort of multiply. So I mean, talking about that team, I mean, one of the sort of key roles that you've taken has been to creatively record the artist gatherings that we've held throughout the project, and you've taken a very individual creative path through that. Can you tell us a bit about how that was?
Yeah, so for each of the 5 gatherings, I wrote a creative response to that experience. The first one being in person and the rest of them virtual. And each one is fairly different. I think 1 or 2 are more traditional, just kind of talking about what happened and what it was like from my point of view. Others are a bit more on the creative side and just kind of going through the thoughts and feelings and concerns and hopes that I had as a result of those gatherings. So some might be read more as poetry, others as traditional reporting, and some as prose.
Yeah, because there were times I remember when they were actually quite provocative. Some of those of like, what are we doing here? Have we lost the plot that we're having to meet online? Is it going against the entire ethos of the project? Or did people? I can't remember did you get responses to those?
I got responses from some people. I think the first gathering was really a wonderful experience, and it was well orchestrated by Emma, and it was great to see everyone in person and spend time together. So I think the shift to going virtual came as a pretty difficult shock for me and other people involved, but also a necessary one for safety. But it came with a lot of concerns. After having experienced that first gathering, how are we going to ever have something like that without being able to gather in person?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And people who are listening, you can read the Philip's reflections on those gatherings on the Atlas Pandemica website. If you go to the news section, you'll find everything there. But your main role in the project was to connect with the individual artists to support, record, and share their research journeys. Can you tell us about how that worked and some of the topics that people threw up and how you got involved with those?
Right. Yeah, I took a very individual approach with each artist to find how they wanted to work together. And with some, it was a very active communication where I'd speak with them on a almost daily basis, and others it'd be a periodic check-in. With some, it was sharing resources, so they would share something they found interesting, and I would think of other artists that might benefit from it and take the time to bring it to them. Other times it was more about just seeing what they were working on and the challenges they were having and thinking of ways I might be able to help, if there was additional research or digging I could do. And then building off of my, past experience and my own searching and looking at all these resources coming out, like you were talking about, all of these things being produced during the pandemic. And, obviously I can't know everything happening, but from what I did see, seeing how it could be shared or used among different projects. So it was very different with each artist. And I think my main goal was help to have more of a sense of connection between the artists and see how sharing ideas could benefit the projects.
So you must have built up relationships with the artists through that communication of sources and references. And you got any examples you could give us of some of the conversations you got involved in with artists, or the stuff that you were sharing?
Yeah. Like, for example, with Joanne, she worked on all sorts of different creations, and I talked a lot with her about what she was reading, because in the social media updates in her project, you see a lot of the outputs, but you may not realize how much Joanne is reading and researching while she's working on these. So I kind of made a point of saying, I really want to know, all of these things, and just getting photos of her bookshelves to understand, the context of where this is coming from and what of it might be useful to others, or all these different angles and ways of looking at past pandemics. And a completely different example would be working with Mark. And it was interesting to see, from the initial talks of how he was going to explore this entire catchment to when he started setting out. And I remember when he went on his first walk and shared some of his experience with me right afterwards. His project was much more about, researching the land and the people and making connections during the pandemic. And so it was interesting to hear his stories, and then also think about how to share what he's learning without hurting the relationships he's building with people.
Mm. And sharing wider, was that part of the role as well, of circulating some of those references into the wider world?
Yeah, I think that's really the ultimate piece of the bibliography, is making it something useful for anyone that is interested in Atlas Pandemica. So that's been what I've been working on the past few months, and has been my focus, is figuring out this. I have huge lists of information and different sets of data, and how to present it in the different ways that will ultimately come out. So I think I want to make everything available, but I also want it to make sense and have some context, and see how it can be connected with the project, so that someone looking at it can find other things. And ideally, I think it should be something that artists in working on similar projects in different regions can come to and see as a connection point.
I'm struck listening to you there, the way you talk about Atlas Pandemica as something with a bibliography. Just could you let us into that picture that you've got in your head of what is Atlas Pandemica to you?
I think to me it is 10 artists going out and exploring, very specific questions in very different ways during the pandemic. And I think it's important to remember that when we set out on this, we had no idea how long the pandemic would last, or if it would get better or worse from week to week and month to month. And so I think we look back on it, and what we've created is a lot different than what we thought at the beginning. But what everyone has done is coming out in different ways, and I think that it all relates mostly, I think, in the sense of place.
And that place being Dumfries and Galloway, as a sort of small region in a small country. So there's that sense of connection of like, well, what's the relevance of that in the context of the bigger world of a pandemic, which is obviously global. Which takes us back to your idea of localism and the literary community. I think, I mean that idea of the fact that it hasn't come out the way that we maybe imagined it in the first place. There's been something fundamental in the Atlas Pandemica approach that we were actually working without an end result in mind. I'm just wondering what your experience of that was with you taking actually, a very creative approach, but a more academic approach. How was that, not knowing where we were going? How did that work for you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting struggle between, the complete academic side and the creative side. And, I think that's been a struggle for me for a lot of different things, being a scholar and being a creative writer, a novelist. And a lot of times feeling completely turned off by academia and, the jokes about, people spending years writing a thesis that 5 people read. And, was really excited about Atlas Pandemica because it's not in the ivory tower. It's not, going to be confined to certain academic communities. Academic communities may take interest, but I see it as targeting a much more wider audience. And I want to make sure the bibliography reflects that and is useful to that audience, and not, rather than with the academic path, there'd be a very strict expectation for what a bibliography is, how it looks, what it contains, everything kind of spelled out. And in that case, my work would not be really creative at all. I still think it's important to serve that academic purpose of having things documented and available and accessible, but to do it in a way that really means something and makes the most use of what a bibliography could be.
I'm wondering with the context of the pandemic, where we're looking at new ways of doing things, and there's a little bit of a sort of crisis of confidence in the way we've created the world that we're now inhabiting, and a chance to build that better is the strap line, isn't it? Whether you see that more creative approach being something that's important for the way that we move forward, rather than that fixed, we know what the result is going to be, we've done it before, therefore we keep doing it that same way.
I think I've heard you and others say something along the lines about, art and cultural work not being so much a nice to have, but actually being an essential part of recovery and driving communities forward. And I really believe in that. And I think a lot of the work that you and the Stove and other groups have done are demonstrate that in Dumfries. And so I think looking forward and looking at how communities build back, the arts are critical, and especially the local. I think every community has different people and different problems, and I think empowering them to find their solutions on their own together is a great way forward. And then at the same time, making sure that the necessary resources and connections are available.
Yeah, I think that empowering thing is so important, isn't it? Of how to do it yourself. And there's something in that creative process that that doesn't assume a result. That kind of, it's like going on a journey together. I mean, and that's how I define Atlas Pandemica. It's the communities, the artists, the bibliographer. We all we all went on a journey together. But I mean, what was your sense of how that journey was being driven? You know, were you like looking to, was somebody in charge that was driving? Because it felt to me like everybody was driving it, but I don't know what it felt like, you know, from
I think,
your position at the bibliographer.
yeah, my sense was a lot of shared inspiration, a lot of shared fear, a lot of shared uncertainty. And I know in some of the gatherings and some of the informal chats we had, people would kind of share that. And on one hand, you know, everyone looked to you and Robbie as the leaders, as the captains of the ship in some sense. And but on the other hand, there was always a clear, open-ended approach communicated back from both of you. So I think everyone went their way and helped each other, because that open-endedness is great, but it's also difficult. And so I think it was good for people to be there for each other, figuring that out. And I think one common stress was everyone dealing with their life in the pandemic and feeling that they, you know, may not be doing enough. And it was a strange kind of common concern, but helping each other out and talking about it, you know, I think got people through that.
I think, yeah, no, I think you're right. I heard so many people say I was really struggling, then I had a really great chat with Peter, or was whoever, you know. That thing about not doing enough was such a common feature of the early pandemic, wasn't it? Of you know, I mean, I think I remember feeling that, yeah, absolutely, that I'm not doing enough, and but it was like everybody else it seems to be doing loads. Everybody else seems to be doing fine, and it was really hard to keep in mind the fact that everybody else was struggling as well, wasn't it? It was sort of like it was a very weird solo experience in tandem with a collective experience. It was nuts.
Yeah, I remember. And I think it was common for a lot of folks, especially in cultural work. I was living in a house with 4 other writers, and everyone kind of had this idea, you know, we're in lockdown, this is the ideal time to be writing or creating. And there was so much stress and everything else going on that it was difficult. It's and difficult to balance that psychology.
Yeah, how to separate yourself in order to do what you needed to do, but at the same time stay connected. Yeah, I've never experienced anything like it. Yeah. So after all this incredible research and sharing that you've been involved in, how did you draw that together, and what are you hoping that people are going to get from the work that you've done on the project?
So I think there's going to be a lot of great resources available, and it will be clear how all of these different pieces of literature, art, other projects, people that influenced each artist relate to each other and to the different artists. And I think that will be easily accessible to everyone, online and in print. I think that hopefully it, one thing I learned from this was that artists aren't always thinking about what's contributing to their work, and it's not really necessarily something that they should be thinking about. And so what I found interesting is that I had that made the opportunity for me to focus on that and see how artists could benefit through seeing new connections they may not have seen otherwise, to being presented with new connections they may have not known otherwise. And so I think hopefully the bibliography can be used by other projects around the world that are community based. And I'd love to see it living. I don't know if that is something that will happen, but I think my dream would be that it is the start of an organized, decentralized connection, way of connecting community projects and sharing ideas and research and creative work.
Sounds good. What would that look like?
I think it means new things coming in. I think all of these projects, these 10 projects, who are they going to influence? Who have they already influenced? You know, a lot of things like the Elsewhere project, you know, on the high street throughout the pandemic has influenced a lot of people in town. And so there's already, you know, now other people that, you know, in an academic world would be citing Atlas Pandemica projects. And how can we do that in an exciting and useful way, I think is what I would want to explore.
Nice. And you said something interesting there about artists being unaware of where their work was coming from. Could you just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I think
what you were meaning by that.
With some of the people in the project, I think they have almost a lifetime of influence going into their work. And so it's difficult to put their finger on, you know, one book or one organization that contributed to it, because it really is a lifetime of experiences. I remember Karen saying, you know, one of her big influences during the pandemic has been going on runs in the mornings. And, you know, so how, you know, we can include that, but I think how do we think about everything contributing and still needing to identify things so that it can help others and be better understood. So, you know, I think the question there might be, how does someone who's never been to Dumfries know what going on a run in the morning is like during the pandemic? Is there any way we can share that without them coming here? I don't know, but I think that, yeah.
I see what you're driving at, but yeah, that sort of unpicking of the threads that are going into to weave something together. But yeah, great. Oh, well, let's hope we can do a bit of that, because that really relates back to place, I think, when you know, and that specificness and the localism, which is wound through it. I mean, what you know, you talked about things that you're learning. I mean, have you got any insights on how we could do things differently from here? How we build back better?
I think local empowerment is critical, and that's already happening a lot in Scotland. It's not happening so much in a lot of other parts of the world, you know, and I have a lot of experience from that, you know, having lived so much of my life in the States, where they take a different approach a lot of times. I think, you know, it's not about someone coming out and solving someone else's problems. It's about communities coming together to solve their problems. And, you know, of course, they need resources and support and connections to make that happen. And that's, you know, where external groups like governments and funding organizations come in. But I think it's the expectation of waiting for someone else to come fix things, or for one solution to be it. You know, for example, a lot of talk about a Green New Deal and things like that, which sound great, but a lot of times what is the Green New Deal in Dumfries right now? What is it that 5 friends could do over the next week in Dumfries to make a very small difference? But adding that up, and I think that this sense of place is developed that way, and a lot of times better solutions come out that way because people know each other and they know the place better than any external group.
Yeah. And as you say, the joining up bit that needs to happen there around resource for that, and also a sort of strategic joining up in terms of, while people will have an idea, it's like, how far can that idea go? That's not necessarily immediately obvious when you're in your local bubble, and the timing of that, of like how far, because from my experience of that, the minute you start doing something at that local level, in the Scottish example anyway, there are people watching from national level who are immediately going, oh, you could roll that out like this, and other people can learn from this model. And you're like, well, we've only just started, and that there's a bit of learning and support that needs to happen around that bit, I think, of giving people enough space and time to develop something to the point where it's got a degree of resilience, but without it being so specific that it's lost those connections, I think, that you were talking about where do the influences come from and how does this join up. It's and maybe the bibliography's part, because I think I've heard you talk about those connecting threads and tying it back to other bits of the world. I think, maybe that's maybe a radical bibliography movement is one of the ways of joining things up a bit.
Yeah.
Who knows? Well, and in terms of this particular project, have you got an ambition for where you'd like to take it next? I mean, where's this project taking you next, I suppose, is the question.
I think it has me thinking more just about how to connect people in a place, connect artists and creative people, but also connect concerned community members around certain issues. And I think for me personally, I see looking at, again, with literature is what I keep coming back to. Another project I worked on during the pandemic was Core Anthology, which was a anthology of poetry and art that people around Dumfries produced during the pandemic, and continuing with that kind of thread, and looking at how to connect readers and writers through perhaps a bookshop, and that really brings all of the writers from Dumfries together with all of the readers, and helps them learn about each other, ideally in person, meeting each other, but other ways as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's a really nice vision, Phil. Well, thank you. I mean, we've come up to our time. That I've learned, every time I talk to you, I learn more about the potential of joining up academia with the creative arts. It's been an inspiring collaboration. Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. And you can find more about Philip's work and all the Atlas Pandemica artists he's been working with, and the rest of this podcast series at atlaspandemica.org. And please continue to tune in for what will be our final podcast, when and if I can track down my co-curator, Robbie Coleman, and we'll have a wee blather about how we approached shaping the overall project, even if we weren't driving it and it was being driven by everybody else. Thank you, Phil. Hey,
Thank you, man. Thank you so much.
Bye.